Jeff, for your time. I mean, a lot of people will ask, but we're so happy that you're with us. And Klaus, thank you for being the one who is asking the questions and interviewing Jeff here, and prepared it together with Jeff, the interview. And floor is yours.
Okay, well, thanks and hi to everybody. Especially thanks to you, Jeff, and thanks for taking your time to be here with us today. Appreciate it. As you said, you just rolled out of bed and had a coffee. So yeah, it's 8 o'clock in Boston. So yeah, we appreciate that a lot. Let's just dig right in. We don't have a lot of time. So I'll do this a little bit historically, the questions. So we start at the very beginning. That's like from the co-trainings we did. My understanding is like the first time you had this idea of, it wasn't called Scrum back then, or where it originates from is like when you flew as a pilot over North Vietnam during the war. So I've heard that story several times, but I'm sure a lot of people here haven't. So I figured if we start off with that, if you could tell that story, like when you went over the border from into North Vietnam. I remember you telling me about how you went immediately into an evasive maneuver, and how that relates to Scrum.
Right. Well, this, first of all, I'm happy to be back in Switzerland again virtually. I used to be there at least 2 or 3 times a year training with Klaus, but haven't been recently. Everything in Scrum operationally comes from my fighter pilot training and some of the military experiences I had at West Point as a cadet. And this particular one is all about responding to change or following a plan. And shortly before I went to Vietnam, I was stationed in Idaho in the United States. And just to show you the effect of Vietnam for the mission that I was on, which was reconnaissance. There were 8 houses on my block, and one morning 4 of the people in those houses were temporarily in Vietnam, and they all got shot down the same morning, and most of them didn't come back. So on that mission, it was probably the most risky mission over North Vietnam, coming in before and after strikes, and half of the people that were on the mission got shot down. So as I was when I went over there and started running those missions, first of all, I knew you were being shot at every second, and so there was no time when you were not going to get shot at. So it made sense to me to, as I entered and crossed the border in North Vietnam, to go into an evasive maneuver and never stop until I got back across the border. But I had a plan. I had a target that I needed to hit. So there was a clear plan, there was a map. So in the middle of that evasive maneuver, I had to hit the target and get home. And I started training, when I was there for a while, I started training other pilots doing these missions, and I taught them to do the same thing. Some of them didn't follow my instructions, and many of those people who flew in a straight line on their map did not make it back.
Did he just freeze?
From fighter pilot training, and that's the OODA loop. Did I freeze?
No, just for a second, you're back.
Okay. John Boyd's OODA loop. John Boyd was the world's greatest fighter pilot, and in his later years, he taught the war colleges, and today the Marines are run totally by the OODA loop, John Boyd's OODA loop. Professor Nanaka, who wrote the paper with Professor Takeuchi, the new product development game in the Harvard Business Review in 1986, that's the paper where the Scrum came from, okay? Today, Professor Nanaka is writing a book on the US Marines. And what he's saying is the OODA loop is more important than the PDCA cycle, which Toyota is famous for. That for Toyota to survive today, they need to rapidly respond to changes in the market. So the whole idea of the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, is that as soon as you engage, and it doesn't matter whether you're flying a mission in an aircraft or whether you're running a project, as soon as you engage, you encounter resistance. If you're building a software product, your competitors are going to resist, obviously, but also you get internal resistance within your organization. Sometimes people want to steal your budget, or they want to steal your people. You have random failures, technology breaks, people quit. So as soon as you do anything, you get direct resistance and sideways resistance. And what John said is, as soon as you detect it, you immediately reorient and then decide to come in at a different angle to disrupt the opposition. Now, as soon as you do that, then the opposition will try to reorient the forces, but before the forces can realign, you're coming around again and making another change to disrupt the forces. So if you do that fast enough, it's called getting inside the OODA loop of your opposition. You win 100% of the time. And that's what John Boyd did. He won 100% of the time. He was called 40-second Boyd because it only took him 40 seconds to decisively win an air-to-air engagement. So that evasive maneuver, okay, they're shooting at me, I'm coming around, I'm coming in at a different angle. Before they can start shooting me from that angle, I'm coming around at a different angle. So this basic idea of responding to change at a much higher evolved level is all about John Boyd's OODA loop, and that's what Scrum is about.
Cool. Thanks for that, Jeff. Yeah, I've heard that story quite a few times before. I always like I said last night, said like a project is not deliberately shooting bullets at you, but that's basically what it feels like when you come in the morning, and it feels like somebody else been shooting bullets at your project again, and you need to avoid those. I always like that story. Okay, let's move a little bit forward in time. So at the beginning of the 90s, you worked first in the medical industry and then for a bank, and you started wondering why some teams are successful in software development and some teams are not so successful. You discovered patterns, and then ultimately you defined Scrum together with Ken Schwaber. This was in '95. Remember correctly, and how has Scrum evolved since then?
Well, just to amplify the history a little bit, in 1983, I was hired away from the University of Colorado School of Medicine. I was a medical school professor for 11 years by a big banking company running 150 banks all over North America. And I was hired, and effectively I was the CTO for 150 banks. And as I watched the projects, I noticed they were all late. And so one day I said to the CEO, have you noticed your projects are always late? And he said, yeah, every morning at least 5 CIOs call me up and they scream at me about it. And I said, well, it's not getting any better. They're using this thing called Gantt chart, and that have thousands of tasks. Everyone has a name and a date. And if you apply a little mathematics to that chart, you will find that the probability of being late is virtually 100%. And so we said, well, what should I do? And I said, well, we need to implement a new operating system for the organization. We can't do it for the whole bank at once. So let's take the worst business unit, and what I'll do is I'll break them down into small teams, 4 or 5 people. We'll have product marketing come in every Monday with a backlog that's ordered by business value. And then Friday afternoon, every Friday, they will deploy whatever they built to 150 banks. And we're going to get rid of the Gantt chart. We're going to give them a burn down chart so we can show them how a fighter pilot lands a fighter aircraft, except they're going to land their project every Friday afternoon. And he asked me, well, who should we start with? I said, let's take the business unit that's losing the most money, the one that's the most broken. We did that, and within 6 months, it was the most profitable business unit in the bank. So this was the first prototype of Scrum at scale, 1983. Now I've been CEO, CTO, VP of engineering of 11 different companies, and many of them were in the 80s. And I'm constantly prototyping this kind of Scrum at scale of working until in 1993, I was asked to come in as a chief engineer at a company called Easel. They had acquired a German company and wanted to build a completely new product line with new technology. And they needed someone who had done a lot of technology innovation. And when I came in there and we started building tooling for building systems, I realized we needed a way of working and using that tool that was very similar to the Scrum at scale prototypes. And so I got the team to formalize it. We read the Takeuchi Tanaka paper, we called it Scrum. And by the end of 1993, we had Scrum pretty much as it is today. And the beginning of 1994, we started sprinting. We delivered multiple releases of a new product which still exists, Object Studio. They tell me every year that revenue has increased by at least 10% since it was built, and it continues onward. And in 1995, the company was acquired by another company. So I'm in the new company, and I think, I really need to get this Scrum thing out of development and into industry. And Ken Schwaber was an old friend of mine. He was a CEO of a waterfall project management company. And I had used him as a consultant on one of the banks I had this big waterfall project. And I asked Ken to help me come in and fix it. So we had worked together. I brought Ken in. I said, Ken, I want you to take a look at the Scrum thing because it really works. And that waterfall stuff that we know doesn't work. And he spent a couple of weeks actually with the team watching what they're doing. And at the end of it, he says, you're right, that does work. It really is similar to the way my company works. He said, if I implemented my waterfall methodology to run my company, I'd be bankrupt. I said, well, why don't you sell Scrum then instead of selling waterfall? And so we talked about it, and we decided it needed to be open source. At the time, we had the XP processes, engineering practices were part of the first Scrum team. I wanted them to be part of Scrum. Ken felt we should have just the framework itself for managing the team. And also Kent Beckett had been following Scrum in the news groups for a couple of years. And he had sent me an email asking me for everything we had on Scrum. He said, I'm inventing a new process and I don't want to reinvent anything. I want to reuse whatever is useful. So Kent had all the stuff on Scrum. And so we said, let's let Kent take the engineering practices. We'll focus on the team management. And let's write a paper on that, and we'll publish it at Uppsala 95 at a track that I was chair of. And that was the kind of the formal publication, first publication for Scrum. So that's how it all happened. And then, of course, in 2001, Bob Martin, who was head of Object Mentor, he had been following in the news group the formation of Scrum in 93, 94. And so when he pulled together a group of people to talk about what they call lightweight processes, he wanted the Scrum people there. So Ken and I were there. Mike Beadle, the first guy that implemented Scrum for an entire organization, was there. We had 4 of the founders of Extreme Programming there, and a bunch of consultants that had written books. And so that's the flow of time from 83 to 2001 from Scrum's point of view.
Excellent. So now that you mentioned the Agile Manifesto, I mean, that's an anniversary coming up next year, 20 years. I know some of you guys at least met in 2011, to discuss again what happened and what should happen. Is there any plans to meet again in 2021?
No, you know, in 2011, there were actually two events. One event at Snowbird, which a few of us showed up for. And there was an event at Agile 2011 where we had an evening presentation. I think almost everyone was there except for Kent Beck, maybe one other person. You know, so we had a big discussion for about an hour or so with a couple of thousand people. And at the end of it, they asked, okay, what would you change in the Agile Manifesto? And Ron Jeffries, one of the founders of Extreme Programming, said, the only thing I would change is put a note at the bottom. You know, the value number 2, you know, working product over comprehensive documentation. We really mean it. Because basically, it's 10 years later and people haven't implemented it yet.
Okay.
And I can tell you the general consensus of the signatories is that, no, we're not going to rewrite an Agile Manifesto. It stands, it is what it is. It's a historical artifact, and it's yet to be implemented by a lot of Scrum teams.
But you have had the discussion about whether to exchange the word software with product, right? Working product.
Yeah, I always talk about product. I mean, one of the, I formed, in 2006, I formed Scrum Inc. Actually, I was requested to do so by the CEO of a venture capital firm. I was consulting with all his companies, and he said, hey, you're working for a patient keeper, a healthcare company. I was CTO at the time. And he says, I don't want my companies sending bills to patient keeper. I want them to send bills to Scrum, okay? So he said, I will give you some space. Why don't you start up a little company? If you need money, I'm ready to write a check. Just tell me how much. And then you'll still be CTO of patient keeper, but all the billing comes out of Scrum Inc. That's how Scrum Inc. got started. And so one of my goals, and he said, he also said, he twisted my arm. He said, you know, you are responsible to actually publish all the stuff you've learned, because a lot of people don't know it, and you should start doing that. And also, we run the entire venture group with Scrum. It's an organizational operating system, and you need to explain how do people do that, because we want all our venture firms running an organizational Scrum. And so those became the kind of prime directives of Scrum Inc. How do we get Scrum into running organizations everywhere? Okay. So we had the advantage of having this started software where there's so much money and so many problems people were willing to invest. But that was just the beginning of something that is useful everywhere. Okay. So for the since 2006, we've been pushing it out. And most of our companies today are not software companies. They're oil companies. They're car companies. They're the biggest brewery in the world. People building agricultural equipment. The biotechs, all the biotechs in Cambridge, Massachusetts, we're working with. The Broad Institute people, the people that did CRISPR. Right now, they're doing testing for COVID-19. The COVID-19 testing is not Scrum, but all the DNA sequencing kind of stuff is pretty much Scrum at Broad. So we have been focused on driving Scrum into many domains and also across the organization. Because getting IT working is helpful, but in order to make an organization successful, the entire organization has to be agile.
Okay. One more topic I'd like to talk about is your book. Stephen Covey, the author of, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, I think he once said, like, if we don't make, if the ladder is not leaning against the right wall, every step we take forward is just getting us in the road to the wrong place faster. So he talks to effectiveness. The counterpart of that would be efficiency. And the title of your book, we see it there in the background, is the art of delivering twice the work in half the time. That sounds to me like it's only talking about efficiency. So delivering the same product just faster. And in my view, agility is to a big extent about effectiveness. So why did you, I mean, from a marketing point of view, I understand that it's a brilliant title, but there's other reasons.
Okay, well, what we find in the venture groups, again, where Scrumming starts, the first thing we need to do with a startup is to get them delivering fast. If they can't deliver fast, nothing else matters. The competition is going to crush them. And we find with Scrum that within a few sprints, we can double, triple production. Then, as we're doing that, we're turning our attention to the sales and the marketing and the market strategy, the segmentation. And we really spend probably 80% of our effort in the company on the product owner side of the business, because we need to get the product owner to deliver twice the value for every point that team is creating. But from the point of view of a venture, if the team can't create a lot of points, we got to get rid of that company very quickly. We'll sell them off, we'll get rid of them. If they can't go fast, it doesn't matter what value they're delivering. Their competition will deliver better value and run circles around them. So that's why there's that focus. Now, more recently, Klaus has complained about this. So in the Scrum at Scale guide, we've gone back to a recent book about Toyota. A guy spent 20 years studying Toyota, Japanese guy, and he wrote me an email when he published his book. He gave me his book. He says, Jeff, you're not teaching Scrum right. He said, what you need to understand is that only 5% of the profit of Toyota is on the assembly line side. 95% of the profit is from the chief engineers who are on the other side of the freeway from the assembly lines. And the way they make 95% of Toyota's profit is they deliver a car that has twice the value and they deliver at half the cost. If they do not deliver at half the cost, they cannot get enough market share to make sense to be in that business. Okay, so he says you need to start focusing on more value, lower cost. And the product owner is the most important thing in Scrum.
I agree on that one. Yeah. And the product owner is about effectiveness and the Scrum Master is about efficiency. I quite like that distinction in Scrum. Yeah. Okay. You mentioned Scrum at Scale already, and you said earlier already in the interview, you said like Scrum was designed to scale. I think you said even scale infinitely. So the question bears that why did you come up with Scrum at Scale then a couple of years ago if Scrum already is designed to scale infinitely?
Well, I mean, the first prototype of Scrum in 1983 was a scaled Scrum, many teams, and an organizational Scrum. So I'd been doing that for, over 20 years. And I was at a conference and the agile leadership from Intel grabbed me, took me aside. They said, Jeff, we've implemented some scaling frameworks at Intel and the productivity per team went down when we implemented it. And I have since found out that the management was furious and has thrown out all the scaling frameworks. And actually they thought Scrum was the root cause of the problem and they banned the use of the Scrum at Intel. And they said, Jeff, you need to fix this because first of all, Intel needs to go faster. There's no way we can do it without Scrum. And these scaling frameworks are giving Scrum a bad name. So they said, you need to be able to, when you add a team, you get an incremental increase in production proportional to the number of teams you add. In the hardware business, they said it's called linear scalability. You need to write down how people get linear scalability. So I started writing it down, and it became Scrum at Scale. And if you look at Scrum at Scale, it's all about having what we call the minimum viable bureaucracy. Because if you put too much heavy weight into it, okay, so the dominant scaling framework is SAFe. Okay, where does SAFe come from? Okay, Dean Leffingwell was Ivar Jakobsen's sales guy for RUP. The Agile Manifesto meeting occurred because the lightweight process people were getting killed by RUP. And even Ivar Jakobsen, Grady Booch, and the people involved in RUP were like, the thing has grown and become more and more heavyweight. It's not what we intended at the beginning. It's going to eventually fall over of its own weight. But the point of Agile was to actually drive a silver stake into the heart of RUP, which it did. Fast forward to about 2 years ago, I'm in Amsterdam. Ivar Jakobsen wants to meet with me. He said, Jeff, we should get together. He has an international standard for defining methodologies called Essence. We should, one of the biggest problems, he's the biggest SAFe provider in Europe. And he says, one of the biggest problems with my SAFe implementation, first is Scrum, bad Scrum. And we should have a set of Essence cards with is the formal definition of Scrum based on the Scrum Guide. And then he said, and we should have, we talked about Scrum at Scale, he said we should be starting to train people in Scrum at Scale also, because Scrum at Scale could be, number one, used to tune up SAFe, and number two, for leadership in non-IT organizations, SAFe is just not the appropriate tool. And he said, I shouldn't be 100% SAFe anyway, because look at what happened to RUP, right? I should have some risk mitigation in my business plan. So we've been working together for the last 2 or 3 years now. I work with their trainers. Their lead trainers are all SAFe fellows. We just did a Scrum at Scale class actually last week out of London and Boston. And we're minimizing the bureaucracy in SAFe. And we have a case study which was accepted at Agile 2020 for Quicken Loans, Rocket Mortgage, the biggest mortgage provider in the United States, probably in the world. They implemented a 17,000 person scaled Agile implementation and 26 release trains. The release train that does the whole front end of the product, the leader of that release train came to Scrum at Scale, trained the trainer, and became a Scrum at Scale trainer, went back, and he didn't eliminate SAFe, he just put Scrum at Scale on top of SAFe, tuned it up. Now, if you look in that paper, you'll see it is actually one of the best SAFe implementations in the world. They actually have doubled production with SAFe. It's the only large SAFe implementation I've ever seen that has done that. When David Wan, the lead author of the paper, used Scrum at Scale to tune up the SAFe, he got 340% more production on top of the doubling that SAFe got. So 2 times 3.4 is 6.8. He's got a scaled Scrum running at 6.8 times faster than a typical non-Agile implementation. So, I wrote that down for Intel because they needed it, but Quicken is the first one that's really implemented in a huge way. And so everywhere we go today, particularly in the oil companies, the car companies, the breweries, the biotech companies, everywhere we go, we implement Scrum at scale. I can't hear you, Klaus, because you're muted.
Oh, that's right. I muted. Because you had some sound problems. There was a little bit of echo, and I wondered whether it was on my end. Anyhow, so yeah, thanks. Impressive numbers also, 6.8 improvement, etc. Do you see any problems? You mentioned that earlier already, like people are not doing Scrum. So generally, is that the main problem you see today, or like what advice would you give people that are trying to either start Scrum or have the feeling that Scrum doesn't work for them?
Okay, well, one of the things, the Standards Group has published data for years, and the latest 5-year data set on hundreds of thousands of projects show that if they split it into traditional project management and agile, the agile success rate is much higher, but what they call challenged or total failure rate is 58%. 58% of agile teams are late, over budget, with unhappy customers, or don't deliver anything. So that is the problem we have in the world of agile. Now, if you go in and you start looking at why they do that, the primary driver is the second value in the Agile Manifesto. They do not have a shippable increment of product at the end of every sprint, or more often. And that causes them to be challenged or fail. And so my focus in the last 10 years is we've got to figure out a way to fix this. And when you go in and look at the Scrum implementations, if you go back to the Takeuchi and Tanaka paper, they were looking at lean product development in companies like Honda, Canon, 3M in the United States. They wrote a book on Toyota, lean product development in hardware companies. So the first thing that Scrum teams need to understand is they should look like lean product development at Toyota. That's number one. Number two, we know from the patterns movement, I spent the last 10 years helping Jim Copeland write this book that we just published. I focused on hyperproductive team patterns. We know that there's certain patterns of play that are essential for high-performing teams. And when we need to scale, we need a minimum viable bureaucracy. So in Scrum at Scale, it's very interesting. When Jim Copeland was product owner of the patterns group, he said, we will never have any scaling patterns because they're always particular to a certain situation and they always will slow you down. So we're not going to have any of those. So if you look at the book, you'll see if a team gets too big, and in the pattern it says, when you start to get to 7 people, you're getting too big, then you're going to need to have to split the team. So there's a pattern called mitosis. Mitosis is a cell splitting. And then as soon as you split the team, then you have to have a way of coordinating multiple teams. So we had to have a Scrum of Scrums pattern. Now, as soon as you have a Scrum of Scrums, the management is going to disrupt the product owner's backlog. So we had to have a pattern to protect the agile implementation from disruption, and that pattern is called a meta Scrum. And those are the only patterns we have in Scrum at Scale. There is nothing else. That is Scrum at Scale.
Okay.
So where did we start on this? Did I answer your question, or?
Yeah, it's like problems that you see with Scrum today. Maybe also I as an insider, I know that there's a new Scrum guide being discussed currently between you and Ken mainly.
Last summer we started talking about, the last update was 2017, and people were saying, no, we should update it more regularly. So last summer we started writing an update, and around the beginning of this year, it was circulated around, And one of the interesting things about the update is we said, we need to reframe. I've been pushing for this for 10 years, but Ken finally came to me and said, hey, Jeff, 10 years ago, you told me we should do this, but now it's clear that we have to do this because Scrum.org is running into a completely different situation. It's not all IT. Scrum needs to be implemented in many different domains. So we need to make Scrum not specific to IT. So he took the word development out of development team. He also, we also did some things. We made done a first-class artifact. We want more focus on not only the sprint goal, but also the product owner's overall goal, which is a reflection, the implementation of the vision. The product owner needs to have a vision, and there needs to be an objective that's going to achieve that vision. And that has not been emphasized enough. And so some adjustments like that. But when we put out the draft of it, there was a lot of kickback, particularly from Ken's own trainers, Scrum.org trainers, created a huge uproar. So Ken said, okay, we're going to go back to the drawing boards. So for the last 3 or 4 months, he's had the leading Scrum.org trainers in the world, some of them, working on that. And by the end of May, he says they're going to have a version that will be ready to, put out again as kind of a beta and let people take a look at it. I don't expect much change from where we were. I think it will still try to make Scrum more generically useful for many domains, not just IT. I think it still will elevate done and the goal, sprint goal, and the product owner's goal will be really important. But I think it will have the leading Scrum.org trainers will have massaged it in a way that they will be able to support it in the Scrum.org training organization. And we'll see how that happens. At Scrum Inc., we're already on board with it. So we're just waiting for Ken to feel like he's got something that will work.
Okay, excellent. I think I'd be, unless there's anything else you wanted to finish off with, Jeff, we could go into questions. I think there's quite a few questions from the audience.
I just want to say that now that everything's remote, I used to come to Europe, to Zurich, Germany, Netherlands. One time I was every month, 2 weeks a month, I was in Europe. Not doing that right now, but I am doing some European classes, and there will be one sponsored by scrumevents.de at the end of the May, and also one sponsored by Zebia in Amsterdam. So if any are interested, those will be set up for European times, and I hope to also be helping Klaus. Klaus and I talked yesterday. Hey Jeff, you should pop into our Scrum class and maybe do a little talk about the origins of Scrum. That would be really great. So I'm going to start helping out our European trainers in their Scrum training as well. So any of these that I'm working with will also wind up on the scruminc.com site. So you can look there if you're interested.
Excellent. Yeah, Mirko was also on the call, and I will do a Scrum and Scale class in, what is that, about 2 weeks? No, beginning of June. Beginning of June, and yeah, and Jeff will make an appearance there in case anybody wants to meet him again. Excellent. Philip, you want to ask a question?
Well, I just look on Mural. There are multiple questions. I tried to get them a bit sorted out. So there are multiple questions on Scrum Masters and planning events and so on. So, but first, because we just came out of the discussion, I like to pick up that one question. In what direction will Scrum develop? Where does the framework currently have pain points that have to be addressed? Someone is asking here.
Well, the whole evolution of the Scrum Guide has been consistently tuning the guide to address the pain points. And the pain points today is that a lot of people still think Scrum is an IT framework. We have to fix that. A lot of people are not done at the end of the sprint. 58% of Scrum teams are not successful, and the primary reason is they can't produce a shippable increment of product at the end of a sprint. So we need to emphasize done. We really, I think the last time in 2017, we had to implement, say that in the retrospective, there needs to be a process improvement, at least one that's implemented as the top priority story in the next sprint. Because we look at major Scrum implementations, like for example, I was at Cisco working with the senior management in Silicon Valley. They had 1,000 Scrum teams just in the Bay Area, and none of them were improving. And it was primarily because people were having a retrospective but not doing anything. So the retrospective is useless unless it generates a process improvement. So these kind of things we've been constantly fixing in the Scrum Guide, and they're not, I would not say they're not changes to the way we did Scrum back in 1993. They're making it clear what people are missing. They're missing the understanding of how to actually make this work.
Okay. All right, so that's good. So basically, do Scrum right before you do something else or different.
Yeah.
Just do it
One of the things that doesn't scale at all is bad Scrum.
Yeah, multiply crap, right? All right.
I noticed there's quite a few questions on Scrum outside IT. If you don't mind, I'll read up 3 of them and you can answer in that direction, Jeff. So one is, what is the main challenge when you apply Scrum to non-software projects? One is, where would you like to see Scrum more, where it's not yet? And again, in parentheses, outside of IT. And the third question, what is next on the evolution of Agile when it moves outside of technology and business and engineers work together as a team? And business and engineers work together as a team, but what comes after relentless improvement? So yeah, mainly Scrum IT, what's next? Scrum outside IT, what's happening there? What do you see?
Well, what's happening with Scrum, and people are telling me all over the world, it's becoming a common language for getting things done. So, if you go to Vietnam and you say, okay, we're doing Scrum, they actually know what you're talking about. and then all the pieces of Scrum, they understand the pieces. So even though there's a language barrier, there's not a Scrum barrier, right? So Scrum is breaking down the barriers all over the world so that teams can work together everywhere. And, my goal from the beginning was, Scrum was benchmarked at 10x. We knew it had to go be 10 times better in order to get any technology innovation has to be 10 times better or you can't sell it. Every venture capitalist understands this. So it was benchmarked at 10x. So we know if you implement it properly, you will get that. And what that means is that every product should cost 10% of what it used to. And so product pricing is coming down, and we're seeing major disruptions. I mean, it is cheaper now to put solar and batteries to run your electricity than it is to operate a gas, coal, or nuclear plant. If the gas, coal, and nuclear plants are free, buying solar and batteries is cheaper than just keeping them running day to day, right? And not all of these vendors are doing Scrum, but I can tell you they're all agile in some way. And the price is dropping. Energy is going to be free. It's already free for me already. I've run everything by solar for years. if energy is free, then everything else starts to become much less expensive, more easily available. So the whole level of the economy worldwide should increase. Also, Scrum in the early days moved into families. You know, there's a book on called Happy Families, where a New York Times author went around, he interviewed a bunch of Agile guys, and then he wrote about how they're using Scrum in their families. So kids are learning how to get their homework done using Scrum, and get their teeth brushed using Scrum, and they're finding a language that allows them to be much more effective, not only as an individual, but much more effective in collaborating with a team of individuals. And we see that in Edge's Scrum, which started in the Netherlands with Scrum in the schools. And those kids in the Dutch schools that go through the Scrum programs are awesome. Yeah, the business leaders in the Netherlands say the most valuable person to hire out of school is someone that's been through Edge's Scrum in the Netherlands school system. So if we can get the cost of everything down to 90% less, and like in the case like of solar and batteries, going down to maybe 1% of where it was, and everybody has a lot more resources, and we can get people to be much more effective as people, and also much more effective at working with other people, then we can begin to solve the problems that we have on this planet, the environmental problems, many of the political problems. They're all caused by people not understanding how to work together and how to make things better for everyone.
Okay. Well, good. There's another one. You mentioned that implementation of Scrum at scale on top of SAFe. Someone is asking for a case study. Is there one available? And would you be ready to? If you
go to, we're going to be doing a webinar at Scrum at Scale on that case study, but it was accepted at Agile 2020. So if you go to the submission site for Agile 2020, it's published there. You probably have to create a free account to access it, but you can download. There's a paper. It's a draft of a paper that eventually will probably go into a
all right. Okay.
Let's just agree we'll figure out how to get that and then document that, and people can download it.
Yes.
Maybe I can get the link. Let me see if I can get the link of that and put it in chat, and then
we can do that afterwards, Jeff.
We can do that afterwards. That's fine. There's another one related to Scrum at scale. So if you have multiple Scrum teams working in on one product, and for technical reasons you need to work with horizontal teams, what would be the most important aspects to consider in your opinion?
You've got a lot of teams working on one product. That's
right.
The best implementation we've seen of that has been at Saab Technologies, the Saab Gripen, the fighter aircraft.
So, and again, we can share. There's a paper on that from JJ and
all right,
Joe Justice. We can share that. We'll put that also in some link collection somewhere, right, Philip? Probably on the mural.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah,
makes sense. Have you found another question, Klaus?
No, actually, I haven't.
Okay, so then I have one where I would like to basically get together out of like 4 of them. So people ask about metrics. What would you recommend to measure for Scrum teams in general? So
you need a balanced scorecard, but the most important metric that is the easiest to get and will improve the team fastest is process efficiency. That is the actual work time divided by the clock time. So I was working with an Indian team remotely, and they asked me, okay, what should our KPIs be in our Scrum? I said, the only one that matters is process efficiency. So I said, all that data is in your Scrum tooling. So just make it appear when you open the Scrum tool, we want to see the running average process efficiency per story in the sprint. And of course, as soon as they did that, they saw it was down around 10%. You know, if something took a day to get done, it took all 10 days of the 2-week sprint before it was done. But once they had that visual on the Scrum tooling, within 3 days, they pushed it to 80%. And on the 4th day, they were done with everything in a 2-week sprint. It was really funny because they called me up. They said, we have no more backlog. We don't know what to do. We're going to have to go talk to management. I said, I told you this was going to happen. Where's your...
All right.
Where's your product owner?
Okay, that's a nice story. For first time Scrum Master, there's a question. What is the best way to start, since certification does not really make you one, right? So certification 2 days, I mean, that gives you a good basic, but it doesn't make you a Scrum Master. What is the best way to start?
We had this problem a few years ago in Japan. The senior vice president from one of the biggest telecoms in Japan came to Boston. He said, Jeff, we want you to set up scrumming training in Tokyo. And I said, well, there's already CSTs over there doing training. He says, it doesn't work. We want the Scrum of Takeuchi Nanaka. So, and he said, we want to build a subsidiary, a joint venture, a company. We want to call it Scrum Inc. And we want to teach what works. He says, we are the Scrum trainers for Toyota Research. We can't go down there and tell them to do what some of these trainers are teaching here. We have to actually teach them the true Scrum, he said. So I said, okay. So we put together a program for them. Now, what happens is Scrum, just Scrum and the Scrum Guide, if people implement it without understanding lean and without understanding the high performance patterns and without understanding the minimum viable bureaucracy in Scrum at scale, that Scrum won't work very well. So we started a certification program in Japan that required them to know Scrum, know lean, know the patterns, and know Scrum at scale. And that's what we teach at Toyota. Mm-hmm. So what's happened from that is that many other trainers around the world have wanted to be part of that program. So we've actually opened it up. But this is what needs to happen. Scrum by itself works, but not unless it's lean, not unless you're doing these high productive patterns, and not unless you know how to do Scrum at scale. Okay.
That's a good point. Needing to add lean into Scrum to make it run. Good point. There's one. I think we can take 1 or 2 more questions, but there's one really scrummy question. So I like them a lot because of the Scrum user group. So what benefits do you see by when you basically put the planning 1 and the planning 2 together in one planning? What made you do that? So a bit more background is asked, I think.
Well, we never had, I guess maybe in one of the Scrum guides that Ken wrote, I never had planning 1 and planning 2. And, you know, particularly with the venture capital group, when I would go in and start coaching teams in our companies, you go into a new Scrum teams or set of teams, or always many teams, and they're doing sprint planning, and they start at 9 o'clock in the morning, and at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they're not done with sprint planning, and everybody's still confused, and they get off to a really slow start. And the reason is because the backlog is not ready coming into sprint planning. So what we had to do is fix the Scrum guide and say, product backlog refinement needs to generate ready backlog, and only that should be discussed in sprint planning. Okay. So if you do it that way, then the time of sprint planning which is a maximum of 2 hours per week of sprint, gets cut in half or more, because you don't. And if you come in without backlog ready, then there are all these questions, and then the product owner doesn't have the answers, and then you can't get the sprint started well. And so, part one of what you're talking about, sprint planning 1, should be done in product backlog refinement.
Okay. So basically, it's extracted to the refinement even more to prepare for planning. Good. So
I was wondering, Philip, should we do a picture with everybody? Like maybe have everybody who wants to be in the picture, like look into the camera, preferably look happy, and then do a screenshot.
Yeah, I've done a screenshot before, but people really
I've done quite a few screenshots, but some people we see from the side. Andreas is really smiling now. We should, see that.
Got 1 of 4.
Really should get
I'll take the other ones as well. Tack number 2. Perfect. Any last? I'll do the screenshots. Jeff, anything you want to give us on our road while implementing Scrum, while trying to do Scrum better? Anything from your side you'd say, guys, do that?
Well, I've had people, Klaus, on his back of Klaus is that book, Twice the Work in Half the Time. I've had CEOs call me up and say, hey, I read your book and we implemented it, and I got 3 times the work in a third the time. So everything you need to know is in that book. So if you're not implementing some of those things in your book, you could actually improve your Scrum by implementing. And again, it's the lean principles, it's the patterns, it's the minimum viable bureaucracy of Scrum at scale. So
I can confirm that book is like, it often is an entry into a company to have them understand it, even at the top level. I know I work with Scrum Inc. at an oil and gas, a British oil and gas, you can figure out which one, company. And like, it all started with that book. They read that book, like one employee read the book, gave it to their boss, and they passed it on upwards. I don't think the CEO necessarily read it, but it went high up, and they ultimately hired Scrum Inc. in.
All right, so time's up, guys. Thank you very, very much, Jeff, for giving us this insight also about the new Scrum Guide. Most of us didn't know. Quite sure. So there's something ongoing there. Yes, Mirko started to give a hand, virtual hand, but for all the others, of course, can take the real hands as well. Thank you very, very much. Yes, thank you very much, guys. Hope to see you again at the Scrum User Group, Central Switzerland soon. Check in for other things. Scrum Geek Roundtable, one of a small format is coming up with what can we learn from task forces. There will be how to use Kanban. How can we use Kanban to make Scrum more efficient soon, and many others like lean agile procurement will come up and give a talk. So stay tuned. Hope to see you again, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon, guys.
Lots of thanks in the chat. Bye, everybody. Thanks.
Thanks,
guys.
for
Bye-bye.
joining.